All right, welcome. Today, we are diving deep into a word that we throw around all the time. But what does it actually mean? That word, of course, is culture.
So, seriously, what is culture? It feels like it should be a simple question, right? But as it turns out, the answer is this incredible story that weaves together science, philosophy, and how we even think about each other.
You see, trying to answer that question has a super long and honestly pretty debated history. So, to help us navigate all this, we're going to lean on the work of anthropologist Luis Nilton Correa. His book, Cultura en 250 conceptos y definiciones, that's Culture in 250 Concepts and Definitions, is going to be our map for this whole journey.
Okay, so where do we even start? Well, like with so many big ideas, we have to go way, way back to the literal roots of the word, from the soil to the soul.
Our story kicks off in ancient Rome with this Latin word, colere. And back then, its meaning was super concrete, It was physical. It meant to cultivate the land, the actual hands-in-the-dirt work you do to make crops grow.
But then, something really cool happens. This very practical idea gets a massive metaphorical upgrade. From colere, we get the word cultus. And cultus takes that idea of growing things and applies it to the human mind and spirit. So suddenly, it's not just about growing crops anymore. It's about cultivating yourself as a person. Even concepts like worship and adoration. And man, this quote just perfectly illustrates that leap. In 1651, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, in his massive work Leviathan, just lays it all out. He writes, "The work bestowed on the earth is called culture, and the education of children a culture of their minds." Boom! Right there. He's making the connection totally explicit. Cultivating land and cultivating people, they're two sides of the very same coin. All right, let's hit the fast forward button and jump ahead a couple of centuries. The 19th century rolls around and thinkers are looking for a new, scientific way to talk about all this. And that brings us to the first really big anthropological theory, evolutionism. And the central idea here, it was this view of human history as a kind of ladder of progress. So, you gotta ask, why did this theory even pop up? Well, think about it. European explorers and colonists were coming into contact with societies that were wildly different from their own. The old religious explanations just weren't cutting it anymore. They needed a scientific-sounding framework to explain all this diversity, to try and make sense of it all. And then, in 1871, an anthropologist named Edward Tyler gives us what many consider the first ever formal scientific definition of culture. And what he wrote was honestly revolutionary for its time. It's that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and it just goes on. The big deal here? For the first time, culture wasn't just, fancy art or philosophy. It was everything a person learns just by being part of a group. Now, this idea of progress was probably most famously mapped out by an American anthropologist, Lewis Henry Morgan. He came up with this theory that all societies move along one single track, a unilinear path, he called it, through three distinct stages. You'd start at savagery, then hopefully climb up to barbarism, and if you really made it, you'd reach the top of the ladder, civilization. And well, guess who they thought was at the top? Yep, 19th century Europe, of course. But, not everyone was buying this neat, tidy little ladder. It wasn't long before a rival theory popped up, and it offered a totally different way to explain why cultures change. This was diffusionism, the theory of spreading ideas. So, the big question is, how do cultures change? And the difference between these two schools of thought is just night and day. Evolutionists, they thought every society basically invents everything on its own, climbing that same ladder all by themselves. But the diffusionists came along and said, no way, that's not how people work. They argued that societies change because they borrow from each other. Ideas, technologies, customs, they spread through contact, through trade, through migration. But get this, even the diffusionists couldn't agree with each other. The whole theory basically split into two big camps. First, you had the British school. These guys, like G. Eliot Smith, were called hyper-diffusionists. They had this wild idea that all important culture started in one single place, ancient Egypt, and just spread out from there. Then you had the German school. Thinkers like Fritz Grabner proposed something called culture cries, or cultural circles. They were a bit more moderate, arguing that culture actually started in several different centers, and then spread out from each of them. So you've got this big debate happening. Is it one ladder or is it spreading circles? And all of this really set the stage for a complete revolution in anthropology. A totally new way of thinking was about to come in and just flip the whole table over, and it was led by one man, Franz Boas. See, Boas and his students came in with this really powerful critique against both the evolutionists and the diffusionists. They basically said that these grand theories coming out of Europe were just armchair speculation. I mean, these guys were building their models based on secondhand stories from missionaries and travelers, not from actually going out and seeing things for themselves.
So what was Boas's big solution? He laid out a brand new, radical method. First up, intensive fieldwork. You had to go and actually live with the people you were studying to have any hope of understanding them. Second was something called historical particularism, which just means you have to understand each culture based on its unique history, not by trying to force it onto some universal ladder. And this was huge. He insisted that you had to separate the ideas of culture, race, and language. He argued they weren't all tied together in the neat little packages previous thinkers had assumed.
And all of this new, rigorous work led to one of the most powerful and, frankly, controversial ideas in modern social science: cultural relativism. And the core idea is this: a person's beliefs, their actions, their entire worldview, it should be understood based on that person's own culture. You just can't judge another culture using your own as the measuring stick. Suddenly, the old language of savage or primitive was out, and it was replaced with the simple but incredibly profound idea of just different. Okay, wow, we've just zipped from ancient Rome all the way to early 20th century America. So why on earth does this journey through some pretty old intellectual history still matter? What's the takeaway? What's the legacy of all these ideas? So let's just do a super quick recap of the journey we've been on. It all starts way back in 1651 with Hobbes making that brilliant connection between cultivating land and cultivating minds. Then, in 1871, Tyler gives us that first scientific definition, which kicks off this whole school of cultural evolutionism. By the 1890s, diffusionism comes along to challenge it. And finally, around 1911, Franz Boas completely changes the game by establishing the principles of cultural relativism, which really set the stage for modern anthropology. And that brings us to the most important point of all. The very concept of culture is itself a cultural invention. Think about it. It started as a simple word for farming, and over centuries of intense debate, it evolved into this complex scientific tool we use to try and understand the incredible diversity of human life. The idea itself has a history. So I want to leave you with this final thought. In our world today, where we're all so interconnected, interacting with people from all over the planet, how do these old ideas of progress, of stages, of single centers, and of relativism, how do they still, maybe unconsciously, shape how we see each other? How do they still influence our own judgments right here, right now?